As we know that Electricity Act 2003 is now 10 years old, and already there is a proposal to amend that, and Ministry of Power has put on its website some of those proposed amendments. And it is in this context that we are going to have this panel discussion. Now, if you recall, the 2003 Act was supposed to be a complete transformation of aiming at transformation of electricity sector. And what was hoped was that the electricity law will bring in competition. And since competition in a natural monopoly is always a problem, unlike, say, like in telecom, what has happened is that the prices have really dropped, efficiency has improved, services have become cheaper, and that has happened because of the mobile phones coming. But something like similar cannot happen in electricity, because if you find that the electricity distribution, it is a national monopoly, transmission is a national monopoly, so how do you do that? So Electricity Act 2003 proposed that generation will be de-licensed. So generation, anyone can set up a generation project. But when it comes to consumer will have choice. So idea was that the large consumers, especially the industry and commercial consumers, they could choose their supplier. But at the same time, realizing the reality that today these consumers cross-subsidize agriculture and domestic, so Act provided that there will be a cross-subsidy determined by a regulator. And there was also, in the Act provided, that the regulator will gradually reduce this cross-subsidy. But we find that after 10 years, that has not happened. So obviously this model has not worked. And the other model which is being thought is that UK model, where you have a separation of wires and service. So the idea is that the wires will be owned by one company in this distribution, and there could be more than one service provider, and that's how the competition could be brought in. So again, this is something which the new law is trying to propose. And then there are certain amendments which are something which experience of last 10 years has suggested are necessary. For example, Section 11, where the state government has powers to tell that the generation can be, in fact, that whole provision is for emergency provision, that in case of any natural calamity, so like the generator can be asked to stop production or curtail production. But in reality, that has been used, and in fact today, Karnataka High Court has upheld the interpretation of the Karnataka government, and the matter is still in Supreme Court. Supreme Court still has not heard. So the interpretation is that state government can say that we are facing shortage, and so the electricity will not flow out of the state. You had to supply electricity, even if you may be having a contract of supplying it outside the state, it has to be supplied only within the state to meet the shortage. And this provision is being used extensively by many states. So this is a very obvious thing. So really the issue is that is the new amendment which are proposed, but basically the separation of carriage and content, is it going to lead us to the desired result, or we are going to be again discussing after another 10 years what should be the way forward? We have very distinguished panelists. Two of my old colleagues, regulators. Then Mr. Mehta has been there in Mumbai. I know him for many years. He has been, now he's the CEO of the Reliance distribution company. And Mr. Chintan Shah represents Suzlon. And obviously another important issue, which again has not figured in the amendments, is that how do you really promote renewable energy, green energy? And I think the proposed amendments have missed out on that. So I would request, I think the best thing would be to start the distribution company, how they look at it and what should be done. Because in fact, Mumbai is one case where the very disastrous regulatory experiment has been done. Because as I said, that you can't have a parallel licensee. But in Mumbai, because of the historical reason, BACS already was a supplier, and Tata, for historical reasons, had a part network. But the regulators thought that he can bring in competition, and so he allowed Tata also to supply electricity. So what happened is very interesting, is Nagpur, that the Mumbai airport, has switched over from Reliance, and all the slums which are surrounding are to be catered by Reliance. So the result has been disastrous. So all the domestic consumers there, they have been burdened with this additional load that they had to carry. So then after, finally, regulator realized that, and he has introduced a cross subsidy, which actually the Act does not as such provide. So this is the same thing because they have been allowed to use that. So I think he's in the best position to tell what we should do. How can we bring in competition? Mr. Mehta.
So good morning to everybody, honorable panelists and the colleagues. Devdutt talked about hierarchy. And in a hierarchy, it is always the one who is the lowest in the hierarchy gets battered the most. But distribution is one of that segment in the electricity segment. So it's always we who come in the forefront of being bad people, not efficient, not serving the consumer, high price, everything. And everybody else gets protected in the process. Now, Dr. Dev talked about Electricity Act, 10 years, need of change because of experience. I'll just walk you through what is the reality of last 10 years. I'll skip slides relating to Reliance because of the time. I was told that we have 45 minutes to close the whole thing. Here is what the agenda of Electricity Act 2003 was: competition, accountability and transparency, commercial viability, access to competition, quality and affordability, and promotion of renewable energy. Quite a few of this Dr. Dev mentioned about. This is the last 10 years record amongst the states. The implementation of these expectations is 0.54, disaster. So what has ailed? Why we have not been able to achieve this? And this is a report which has been done by Deloitte in 2013. There are lead states like Maharashtra, Delhi, and Orissa, but there's a lot of states which are way behind in achieving the direction which was set by Electricity Act 2003 in the interest of the consumers, in the interest of the businesses at various hierarchy in the electricity sector. Here is the last 10-year record, how the accumulation of losses have happened over a period of time, and we are at 2,000 billion shortfall of recovery or mismatch between the cost and the recovery. 2,000 billion. Here is a gap between the cost and the tariff. Electricity Act never envisages that. It says the tariff should be cost reflective. It should be given timely. Here is an outcome of that. Multiple committees set their observations. Here is Mr. Shunglu committee. I'm not going to read out through this. Here is Mr. Chaturvedi, headed committee. And here is an ATE directive which was given suo motu, looking to various issues which have been referred to them out of the various pronouncements of the regulators. And I'll read this out because this is interesting. HERCs to ensure annual performance review, true-up of past expenses, ARR, and tariff determination to be conducted year on year as per regulations. HERCs to decide the tariffs before 1st April of the year. In case of delay, HERC can suo motu proceed for the tariff determination. That means if the distribution company does not file its annual revenue requirement, the freedom is to the regulator to go ahead and issue a new tariff effective 1st April of each year. Regulatory assets should not be created as a matter of course, which means cost-reflective tariff should be given. But Dr. Dev pointed out a very, very pertinent point of cross-subsidy, which should have finished in 5 years from 2003, or would have come into a minimum of 20% plus minus, but we are nowhere there. And that's a life as it is. Recovery of regulatory asset, if at all created, should be in the shortest time recovered. Carrying costs on regulatory asset should be permitted because it's ultimately funded by somebody. And fuel and power purchase costs, which is not in the control, partly it is deregulated, should be passed through so that it doesn't get caught into the system. Imagine a situation here if you accumulate to be recovered later, the cost of carrying it over paid by the consumer is much higher than he would earn by keeping that money in a fixed deposit. So why should he be penalized in saving less and paying more at a later point of time? Then there was a committee headed by Mr. Lavasa on how to correct the gap which has arisen. Now, what do we need? What are the needs of relooking at the Electricity Act? One is sustainability, where again, no regulatory asset should be created, which is what AT has also observed. Tariffs should be revised every year. Accountability, there should be an accountability of the government, of the regulators, and of course, the players in the industry, which is distribution company or generation company or whosoever it is. There should be a competition. Dr. Dev mentioned about wire retail separation. It is a hot topic. I believe there is a session on that, so I would not delve into that much. Access to power or electricity to everybody. Look at a dichotomy. We want supply to go to the rural for upliftment of rural, perfectly good. But we want at a certain price only because of affordability. Who compensates for that? Partly by the government. Government says, oh, we are short of funds, we cannot. So try and recover within the system. And that is where the imbalance starts coming in. That's where the differentiation between the areas get into it. And I'll give you a classic example of Mumbai, which Dr. Dev mentioned about. There is a huge impact of consumer mix in the system. Now, we serve about 10 lakh consumers who live in the slums. The other BEST serves about 4 lakh consumers, 6 lakh consumers who live in the slums and who has to be given electricity at lower than the cost of supply. The government says, no, we are not going to fund it. Please do it within the base of your own consumers. Fair enough, perfectly all right, working very well. Here comes a new player. He says, oh, I am free to supply. I have no backlog of this low-end consumer who I have to subsidize. Even though I am expensive by power, yet I'll supply at a cheaper price because I have no baggage of cross-subsidy. How does that help consumer? How does it help the society as a whole? It's the most intriguing question to be answered. Why Electricity Act implementation has failed? Obviously, one should look at that there's a need for administrative changes. There's a need of implementation. There's a need to get out of the supporting political needs in the requirement to implement a law. Let the government decide to give subsidy if they want to give it. Why should it mess up the system itself? So, policy should be implemented as expected. Act should be implemented as expected. There should be a proper framework drawn. And there should be commonality of implementation on the basic fundamentals, cost-reflective tariff, timely. And I think there is a forum of regulators who can be the guiding force and whose findings should be then implemented. It should not be that these are guiding factors only. They should be implementable. I think then we would be able to reach to a certain level of reaching to a success of what was envisaged in Electricity Act 2003. Otherwise, we'll keep changing the laws, we will keep tweaking the laws, but if we don't implement it, we are going to be again talking after 10 years, another 2,000 billion to be supported by the government. In the meantime, banks are overloaded, the productive money which could have gone into the GDP growth would get into kind of stagnated income to be funded by the government at a later date, which will not be productive. Well, I'll finish with this thought process. My only thing is, yes, Electricity Act needs to be amended to the extent what our learnings have been over a period of time. But yes, there's a bigger requirement that administrative implementation of what is expected should be brought into the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. I think Forum of Regulator has already taken up this matter, amendment to the Act, particularly the separation of wires and that content. And that's why I think it will be appropriate that if I ask Mr. Prasher to give his views, what needs to be done. Because this has been deliberated in Forum of Regulator. I think given the organizer had told me that we have to finish by 12:15, so I think 5-6 minutes is all, and then time for questions.
Good morning. I'll just focus on 3 issues. One is what's been talked about, the separation of carriage and content. What's been discussed in FOR, one issue to my mind needs some course change. It's been proposed that the existing licensee will be split into 2, and he will hold a kind of monopoly over the carriage business for a certain foreseeable period. Now, I have no issue with that, but at present, as the law stands, a distribution license can be given for a municipal area. In most of the states, there are 1, 2, or maximum 3 distribution companies. Now, after separation of the license into 2 parts, the distribution company will hold the carriage license for the entire area of his license today, which is sometimes whole of the state or half of the state. So something which can be done today for a municipal area will, after this amendment, be enlarged to a much greater extent. Is that desirable? I think we need to apply our mind to this issue. And if we think that enlargement of the carriage license from the present municipal area to a much larger area, sometimes extending to the whole state, is not desirable, then we'll have to find an alternative solution to this. On the question of open access, there has been recently a development in Haryana. The government suddenly invoked Article 30, Section 37 and said all open access, short-term open access is banned. The matter was brought before our commission, and we stayed that order till the next date of hearing. Next day, the case was listed in the High Court also. The High Court supported our order, in fact, incorporated large paragraphs from our order in their order, and allowed short-term open access to continue. This issue of the state governments using various sections of the Electricity Act to somehow interrupt the open access process perhaps needs to be crystallized in some way in the amended Act. The state of Haryana banned this in spite of a clear appellate order that this section does not authorize the commission or the distribution company or the government to ban open access. So this needs to be taken care of. Lastly, there's the issue of the role of regulators. Last evening, it was clear that there is lot of diffused area. One opinion was given that regulators have to take care of the practical considerations also. The other view was given that the regulator has two distinct roles, one where he works as court and the other where he works as monitoring, control, helping, facilitating, sustaining, etc. Now, what is the intent of the Act? Does the Act wants to merge the two roles when the regulator passes an order, or the Act wants the two roles to be distinct? The confusion was very apparent when I took over, and I think that situation continues in many commissions even today, that the regulators were becoming parties before the APTEL and before the High Court also. So our commission took a position that as a rule, will not become a party. And for the last 2 years, Haryana Commission has not become a party before the APTEL or before the High Court. In one case, the High Court asked us to appear. We appeared, did not put up any written submission. We said we are an adjudicatory body. If the court so desires, we'll assist the court, but will not become a party to the case, and the High Court accepted our contention. The confusion seems to have arisen from a very small entry made in the Act. While the sections relating to appeals do not say anything about it, in one of the appendices, where the format of appeal is given, the format says respondent including the regulatory commission. That is perhaps what has caused the confusion. I think this needs to be clarified. To my mind, as adjudicators, the regulators should not become parties in appeals against their orders, but the law needs to clarify it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prasher. I think I will request now Mr. Chintan Shah, because the green energy, because as you all know, the renewable energy certificate market we had introduced, idea was that this will give encouragement to the generators of green energy to produce more, and that will add to the quantum of renewable energy. But actually that market has collapsed, and that's why what needs to be done to this act to make this effective.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. Been talking about hierarchies, everyone is talking about hierarchy. At times, renewables is a lesser mortal as far as the Indian power sector is concerned. So much so that Mr. Mehta's presentation also talked about Competition Electricity Act 2003, the last was renewables. So we are always the last one to come in. Having said so, India has added more than 30,000 megawatt of grid-connected renewables by this time. So in spite of all these things. And what is important to know is renewables is a no-brainer, because that is a resource which is available within the country. If you're talking about energy independence, I think renewables is a solution. And that, I think, almost every country in the world has realized, so much so including our country. However, the problem with renewables is different. It's so fragmented. You don't put a 5,000 megawatt renewable project. You put 100 megawatt, 25 megawatt. So you are smaller in size. And very intelligent people in the government starts experimenting with renewables. Hey, let's do this. Let's try out competitive bidding in renewables. Let's try out forecasting in renewables. So people have these great ideas, and they start experimenting on renewables because it's possible, because they don't fight back, being so small in size. However, talking about Electricity Act 2003, I have a different approach to it. What used to happen in telecom a couple of years back, after the promulgation of TRAI, the entire telecom sector got into litigation. Huge amount of litigation was happening. So much so that today, electricity sector is today becoming a litigation sector. I think when one is planning to amend Act 2003, one should also take the list of the litigation happening across India, be it in the APTEL, be it in the High Court or the Supreme Court. And one need to account this litigation in the amendment so that at least the sector becomes litigant free. So I don't think anybody is interested in fighting out in the court. People are business houses who would like to put a project, sell electricity, do open access, whatever. Nobody's interested in fighting. So I think the Act 2003 has to also look into it, that how can the sector be litigant-free? It cannot be zero, but we need to minimize it. And there are very funny litigation happening. For example, the Rajasthan High Court rules that the obligated entities for renewables are consumers also. While on the other side, the Gujarat High Court has reserved the judgment in saying that, well, consumers may be excluded as obligated entities. I think such things, clarification needs to be issued under the amendment of the Electricity Act. The couple of points I would like to raise as far as the amendment is concerned. To start with definition itself, renewable energy is not defined under the Act. Can it be defined? I think it should be defined what it includes. The reason is, at times the industrial cogeneration is mixed with bagasse-based cogeneration. So we need to differentiate what is meant by renewables. Section 3 of the Electricity Act talks about 3 different policies: national tariff policy, electricity policy, and rural electrification policy. Can be a 4th policy, national renewable energy policy. I think that would give a huge amount of impetus for the future. Again, definition of the obligated entities needs to be somehow documented under Act 2003. There's a huge amount of issues to do with RECs. More than the RECs is the RPO enforcement. Most of the commissions have passed regulations or orders for a certain minimum percentage to be procured from renewables. But at times we see these RPO targets are not getting implemented. Certain commissions have been serious enough to issue directive. For example, Mr. Panjiar has issued an order where he has fined the MD of the DISCOM for non-compliance of RPO at a personal level. But I think there's a limitation with the regulators in terms of the powers they've been given under the Act 2003. Can they be given teeth also to enforce the RPO enforcement, provided renewables is available? If it's not available, it's a different story. And that's the reason that REC market is not getting picked up, because there is no penal action for non-compliance of RPO. So I think that also needs to be looked into, very, very important. A couple of countries globally are now planning 50% of the new capacities from renewables, particularly Germany, even China, and a couple of other developing countries, because they've realized that the world doesn't have enough coal and gas for the future, and the prices can be very, very prohibitive. So they have taken a very conscious decision that all new capacities, at least 25 to 50%, has to be coming from renewables. Can that be thought about in India? Maybe, I don't know to what extent Electricity Act can look into it. It's a question that I've left it open. And more importantly, this, I don't know why nobody has been raising this, is Section 164. When you do any power project, you draw transmission lines. And how can the Act 2003 modify the 164, which is under the 1861 Telegraph Act, where you can allow, this is the basic issue of right-of-way, where you have a huge amount of, most of the delays in the projects happen because of right-of-way. And can this be looked into more detail so that the power projects that are coming up, the transmission line linkages that are coming up, are smoothened out and completed in time? That's the couple of things I had to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chintan Shah. Mr. Panjiar, who has advantage of having worked in Ministry of Power, and then he has been now regulator for, I think, more than 3 years.
Thank you very much, sir. We all know when the Electricity Act was enacted, the basic objective behind it was to increase efficiency, transparency, accountability, provide universal access to the people, and also ensure the economic viability of the sector. Now, when we see down the line in the last 11 years what objectives have been achieved, we see that the universal access has not been achieved. A large number of households which are still unelectrified. Economic viability, we had thought that it will improve. It has deteriorated so far as the distribution sector is concerned. And competition. There is a provision that the power will be procured on competitive bidding, but this route has also not succeeded. We are seeing cases after cases. We are also going to receive a case where now tariff was determined on the basis of competitive bidding, and then the developer wants change in the tariff structure. So what is to be done? Amendments are required to address these issues. I will address only 2 or 3 issues. One was about the choice of the consumer. That was one of the objectives of the Act. Now, with the introduction of open access in transmission and distribution, choice has been provided to certain category of consumers, which are the large consumers. The open access is available either to the consumer or to the generator. Open access is not available to a supplier, to the common consumer. And therefore, this talk about separation of distribution and supply business. Now, today, if a small consumer wants, he cannot get open access. And even if he gets open access, he will not get any electricity, which will be cheaper than the tariff at which he gets the electricity today. Therefore, this thought came about the separation of wire and content business. But there are certain loopholes in this, and there are certain risks which have to be addressed. One is about the cross-subsidy part of it. When the new supplier comes, the universal service obligation normally is with the existing supplier. When a new supplier comes, he will try to cherry-pick the consumers and supply only to the high-end consumers. That will put the burden, this was mentioned just now, this will put a huge burden on the other consumers, which are who are at the lower end. Therefore, when the Forum of Regulators considered this, it was suggested that even the new supplier should have the universal service obligation. And even if a small consumer wants supply from the new supplier, he cannot be denied the supply. That is one aspect. Secondly, whenever there are 2 suppliers using the same network, the consumer mix will always be different. And therefore, the level of extent of cross-subsidy required under the system will also be different in case of 2 suppliers. So the law should, when it is amended, also provide how this cross-subsidy can be handled, whether one supplier can cross-subsidize the other supplier. That is a very ticklish issue, how it can be done. But that issue has to be addressed in the amendment. So the universal service obligation of all the suppliers and the cross-subsidy element. So these 2 issues have to be addressed. Now the second thing was mentioned by Dr. Dev was the use of Section 11 to deny open access to outside consumers, and also to deny the fulfillment of the long-term PPAs by the generators. Now the Forum of Regulators has suggested that the Section 11 should be amended to provide that this section cannot be used to frustrate the long-term PPAs, commitments made by the generator under the long-term PPAs, and they should not also be used to deny open access to consumers outside the state. So that is the amendment which has been considered by the Forum of Regulators. The third issue is about it was mentioned by Mr. Chintan Shah, how the provisions of renewable purchase obligation and REC are not being followed. And the reason, rightly he mentioned, that there is no penalty for it. If a distribution company does not comply with the RPO, what do? You proceed under Section 142. And the penalty under Section 142 is rupees 1 lakh for the contravention and rupees 6,000 per day for the continued contravention. So considering the total volume of transaction of a distribution company, this amount is nothing, it's a peanuts. And therefore, it doesn't act as a deterrent to the distribution company. And therefore, there's a need to amend this provision to increase the penalty to a much higher amount, which will act as a deterrent to the company. Secondly, it was mentioned by Mr. Chintan Shah also, that under the regulations, we have provided that if the DISCOM does not comply with the RPO obligation, then the Commission can order that certain amount should be deposited in a separate fund, which fund can be used under the direction of the Commission for promoting renewable energy, for meeting the RPO obligation, or for purchasing the REC. And in the last tariff order, the Bihar Electricity Regulatory Commission also has provided for a separate fund with a very small amount of 20 crore rupees. I think this will help in ensuring that the RPO obligation is fulfilled. Lastly is about the independence of regulators. Regulators are very much dependent on the government in two ways. Number one, the members of the regulatory commissions are appointed by the government. If the government does not appoint a member, what will happen? It will become non-functional. This has happened in some cases. And therefore, the Forum of Regulators also has recommended that if the government does not, particularly in case of the SERCs, if the state government does not initiate the process of appointment of a member, then the committee, which is selection committee, which has been constituted for appointment of members of the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, can also recommend the names of candidates for appointment as members of the State Electricity Regulatory Commission. The second dependence of the Commission on the state government or the central government, as the case may be, is about the sanction of posts. Now the posts can be sanctioned, but with the approval of the government. I think there's a need to, change this, and the Commission should be at a liberty to sanction posts as per the requirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Panjiar. Before we go for Q&A, I just want to raise this one issue. If you see this 10 years, has anything really changed? Because if you see the electricity scenario, because it is completely dominated by government, because all the electricity boards were owned by government, they functioned as if they are part of the government. Today we have, after unbundling, but the fact remains that distribution companies are still owned by government. Act implied that privatization should be resorted to, but do you think that any state government is going to privatize distribution? So we again come back to the same problem, because if we are talking about separation of wire and service, who will own those wires? It will be owned again by government. So will government allow any private player to come as a competitor? That itself is an issue. So if we are looking after 10 years, any amendment, are we going to really move forward, or we are going to start from the same point? It's like the open access, which has really not happened. And that is basically the problem is very much built in the way the electricity sector is run. But unfortunately, what has happened is that because of the generation being de-licensed, and also electricity trade has increased. Today we have nearly 9% electricity in short-term market, and that is nearly of the order of $4 billion US. So it is a fairly large market. So that has really attracted private sector. And today the position is that out of 250 gigawatt capacity, 40% is owned by now private sector. And by 2017, it will be almost 50%. But then after that, we don't know who's going to invest in power sector. So when we go ask the questions, let's keep this focus in mind. So we can have a couple of questions.
Good morning, everyone. I have one query in my mind and one request to these honorable regulators. The query is that on the one side, Ministry of Power is focusing on PPP model for the distribution business, and most of the states have already started taking the initiative in this regard. On the other hand, Electricity Act proposes the separation of distribution and supply business. So for the states who will go for distribution licensees or PPP model, before the Electricity Act is formally amended and announced, what will be the impact on their contractual arrangement with the states? That is my query, because yesterday we were talking about the sanctity of the contract. So there will be long-term contract, and after 2 years, say, or 1 year, this supply business comes into picture. So how will that contract be affected? That is my query.
I think that is part of the proposed amendment, that the existing PPAs of the existing distribution licensee will be allocated between the other people who will go into the content business. That is part of the act already, with the proposed amendment already.
No, see, again, that takes you to the same issue. When it is a government-owned, now question is that if you are going to bring in competition, that means we'll have to allow some private player to come. Now, many of the old PPAs, that is the cheapest power available. So is any state government willing to give that cheap power PPAs to the new player? Otherwise, the new player will be, to start with, at a disadvantage, because he can only buy new power, and that new power is bound to be more expensive. So again, unless we are talking of this separation, that remains the issue. Next question.
Second part regarding request. In the proposed amendments in the National Tariff Policy, along with the Electricity Act, which was published on the website of the Ministry of Power, most of the points are related to the power generation and not to the distribution sector. So if you see, there are a lot of technological advancements taking place in the distribution sector with the introduction of, say, smart meters or prepaid kind of meters. So if we go into the legacy systems, there are certain hindrances in implementation of this new technology with respect to the tariff. So my request to the state regulators is that to think about the separate tariff structure for the prepaid meters or the smart meters, so that at least the issues which are not practically implementable in these technologies can be addressed.
I think in the proposed amendments, the concept of a smart grid has also been introduced.
Yeah.
A smart grid will be defined, and some arrangement will be there that the cost of the smart grid can be loaded on the ARR or on the tariff of select category of consumers.
Sir, Mr. Chintan Shah was quite rightly saying about the downward trend and the dismal market of REC certificates, and that RPO should be made mandatory. Now, we discussed, and Mr. Panjiar also suggested about the penalty, how low the penalty is, and things like that. It would need a drastic change. My question is, since this is a very important and serious affair, can something be done immediately to bring it back? Is there any way, sir, to you, sir, is there any way we can do something immediately instead of waiting for such a long time for an amendment of the Act, etc.? Because it's a very serious matter that he talked about.
As I mentioned, most of the regulations, they provide that if the RPO is not met, the state commission can order that a certain amount should be deposited in a separate fund, which can be used for meeting the RPO or for purchasing the REC. And in the last tariff order, the Bihar Electricity Regulatory Commission has also provided certain funds for this purpose.
See, on the other hand, in Gujarat, the regulator has allowed that to be carried forward. Now, if you carry forward, then that RPO has no meaning, because after all, unless a demand is created, there will be no transactions, because there will be only sellers in that market, there will be no buyers. But again, the issue comes is, today you will find that all the state governments are affected by a Kejriwal phenomena. So all the state governments want to reduce tariff. So one of the arguments which the regulators have also given, how can we increase tariff now? Because buying green energy is slightly more expensive, the tariffs will go up. It's a different matter if you see the entire annual revenue requirement or the budget of distribution company. It's a very small fraction. But again, the argument given is that this money will have to be paid. Because this is also the small wind farms, you can't withhold payment for long term. Although the fact is in Tamil Nadu, for 1 year the payments were not made. So this is again a reality.
But sir, if this happens to RPO, what will happen to HPO? It will be a non-starter from the beginning. In this conference, we are going to discuss also about HPO, hydropower obligation. If this happens to renewable power obligation, what is going to be HPO? It's going to be non-starter from straight away.
So that's why I said that again we can have a very theoretical discussion and say that this should be the amendments. But question is that the implementation of the electricity, what do we really do want to do? So unless it is becomes a political issue, and since we are discussing in this session, I think it is the time that central government needs to discuss with the state government that how we should move forward. Because you can't really hold regulator responsible, because regulator has limitation. Because regulator is anyway appointed by state government. But even assuming that we have a very fiercely independent regulator, but the fact will remain is that the state government, since they own the supply business, the real issue is that the Electricity Act 2003 wanted to introduce electricity as a commodity and create a market. Now that has not happened after 10 years. So how are we going to create this market? So unless there is some political consensus that the market should be created and that's going to benefit consumers, but if we are going to take a short-term view, then obviously the prices are going to go up because you are HPO or RPO, that will add to that. But on the other hand, we have also this phenomena that there is a shortage of peaking power. So again, the peaking power will be more expensive. So again, that remains the issue. It is the
I have a follow-up suggestion on this, sir. The large amount of money is being raised from clean energy cess applicable on coal. So why don't you direct that money for fulfillment of RPO, right? At least for the current year. So we don't know at least I am not aware of what's happening with that money. And then if the Act recognizes the use of that money for meeting RPO and reimbursement of that cost to the DISCOMs, so that consumers are not burdened, so one way at least give a short-term boost to the renewable market.
I think Mr. Verma.
In regard to the RPO, it only shows that only a section of people like us or at the central commission level, we made this scheme and this scheme is not implemented, so states are not cooperating. And the whole the state machinery is not cooperating because the regulators are not, the state regulators are not enforcing this. Although in the central scheme there was a penalty which is equivalent to the price of the cost of the price of these RECs, but this has not been implemented. My suggestion I had given in the Central Commission and FOR also that this renewable energy must run. This energy should be absorbed in the local grid, and the RPO should be a matter of only accounting procedure. And to that extent, when the bills are made by the RLDCs, etc., or the load dispatch centers, that much percentage of power should be deemed to be coming from the renewable source of energy, and therefore no question of any purchase or not purchasing should not arise. Now, we are putting the generators to a great loss. Their money is not recovered. So serious thought should be given to this kind of an arrangement, that it is only an accounting. After all, as Dr. Dev said, that there is a peaking shortage and we were thinking of ancillary service. And we were also saying that this costly power shall be booked to those people who are having more of uninterrupted UI. So we book them. They need to pay that. Some such arrangement can be done if the renewable energy is to be encouraged.
See, about this green energy, what has really happened is that FOR did this exercise, realizing that by 2017, under the National Action Plan on Climate Change, we had to start with 5% in 2010, and every year we had to add 1%. So by 2017, it will be 5 plus 7, 12% should be the share of green energy, and what should be the targets. And based on that study, what the FOR found, that each regulator will have to move, a certain trajectory was also given. And the target came to something like 42,000 megawatt of green energy should be added in the 12th plan. But the reality is that the MNRE itself did not want that target. Their target is only 32,000 megawatt. Now, unless we have in the international debate on the climate change, I think government is going to find itself in a very awkward position. What is happening in WTO, we need to look at it this way, and it has to have some political acceptance that whatever we call the green energy, a certain percentage has to be achieved. And that kind of commitment again will be coming because again, if you see the National Action Plan climate change, it has no political sanction. It has not even been approved by the central cabinet. And unless you can bring the states on board, it's not going to happen. So again, we can go on theoretically discussing what amendment should be done. Because again, I find that the electricity is very much a political matter and it has to be dealt at that level. And I think the last, then we have to close with this.
So for my suggestion for Electricity Act amendment, basically for RPO, will be, under RPO we have made two subgroups, solar, non-solar. We should remove this. We should say renewable power obligation. And this must include solar, non-solar, and also not only micro-hydel, but all hydro projects also. So this will facilitate the better fulfillment of obligations.
No, anyway, hydel, we are not considering as a renewable energy here, only up to 25 megawatt. So if you bring in the hydel, the whole picture will change, and that will be completely different matter. So I don't think we can really now deal with this in this, because we have to conclude this session. So I thank all the panelists. Thank you.